Unit 2, Evaluating Information. Our student learning outcomes for this unit is outcome number 5. The student will evaluate information for credibility using a variety of criteria. Today we're going to look at how we can evaluate information, and I'm going to show you some criteria that were developed by the librarians at Ithaca College that can help you to interpret and evaluate information for credibility and relevance to your research question. We're also going to look at Klepfield's concept of the continuum of reliability, and we'll look at that by reviewing a research guide that is available to you through the library website that I've created. And so we're going to go through and look at those things together today. This content falls under the authority as constructed in contextual threshold concept on the framework for information literacy. The idea here is that information resources reflect their creators' expertise and credibility and are evaluated based on the information need and the context in which the information will be used. And so we want to think about, instead of a bad source or a good source, we want to think about what context we're in, we want to think about how we're using the information, and we want to think about how that information was created. We're going to build on what we learned last week in Unit 1 about how information is created and how it gets to us. To look at how authority is constructed, how we decide what is credible, how we decide what kind of information we should use, whose expertise we should trust. But we also want to acknowledge that authority is constructed in the idea that various communities recognize different types of authority. So depending on who your audience is, that could impact the authority of some type of source that you're using. And so some of this is about knowing your audience, knowing who you're speaking to, and knowing what they value in terms of authority. Authority is also contextual in that the information need may help determine the level of authority required. And so just like we were talking about with the context earlier, depending on who you're speaking to could change the level of authority that is needed. If you're speaking to your professors in college, they're going to have a high level of expectation for you to use authoritative sources, whereas as opposed to if you're talking to a group of friends, they may not be as concerned about the level of authority, or they may be evaluating authority through a different lens. And so we want to look at those things and be mindful of those things as we talk about how we can evaluate information for credibility. This also falls back to scholarship as a conversation. So remember, we want to tie everything back to the concept of scholarship as a conversation. And so sometimes when we look through information, for us to evaluate it, we have to understand how it got to us. And so we want to continually be thinking about what went on, where in the conversation am I entering here? Is this early in the information cycle? So I'm early in the conversation. Has this conversation been going on for a long time? Is this one part of the conversation part of a larger conversation that I need to be paying attention to? We want to think through all those kinds of things when we're encountering information. I know this may seem overwhelming at the moment to think, oh, I have to think about all these different things when I'm using a piece of information. It will become second nature to you. It will become something that's just natural for you to do if it's not already. And so don't enter it with trepidation. We will figure this out, and we're going to learn about this together this week. When we consider the information landscape, the landscape that we used to have, that you may have grown up working within, was fairly simple. For the last century, we've been dealing in print mainly. We've been dealing with books. And so things that we kind of recognize, there were some audio versions available, things like that. It was a little more controlled about the format that something would get to you. Most of it was print. And so we've seen a shift with the change in how we get information. We've seen a shift in that landscape, and now it looks a little bit more like this. And so we've gone from being, librarians like myself have gone from being gatekeepers of information to being sort of like jungle guides. The gate, as I said in our last unit, has been flung open, and now our role has shifted. It's actually always been this, but our role and position in all of this has shifted a little bit more to the side of being a guide on the side for you. So being someone that will help you along the way and who knows the landscape of the jungle and knows how to get you through to the places that you need to be and get you to the things that you need to answer your research questions. And so keep this in mind that our landscape in the last 20 years has gotten much more complicated than it was even 50 years ago. And so we need to be thinking about the fact that the landscape we're working in now is likely different than the one that you grew up with or the one you were familiar with. And so we're going to look at what all that means. And so why do we need to evaluate? Why is evaluating information so important? As citizens of the world, we have a responsibility to evaluate the information that we create, consume, and share. I would go further in saying that as Christians, as people who are called to the truth, called to be a people of truth, and you'll see this reflected in your devotional this week, as people who are called to be truthful with one another in the way that we deal with one another, I think it is vitally important that we evaluate the information that we're sharing to make sure that we are truly being diligent to put forth something that we currently understand to be true. This year has been the year of fake news. That's the buzzword of the time. And this has been going on much longer than this past election cycle. And so we want to really look and see what are some things that we can approach information with. How can we evaluate these things to know whether or not something is reliable? It has gotten much harder than it was in the past. When we had that simpler landscape, it was a little bit easier to kind of look. There were some safeguards in place for us. And with the incredible access that we have now comes an increased responsibility on the user of the information to really do due diligence and look and see if the things that they're using are truthful. I like this quote from Kevin Clipfield. He says, "Does the information seem to represent the world accurately according to our best understanding of how things are at the particular time and place?" Often that's the best that we can do, and that's from his lesson on thinking critically about information. What's really going on here is when we have asked you to evaluate information, we ask you to critically think about the information that you're using so that you're not just blindly consuming information. You're really thinking about all of the pieces and all of the moving parts that go together to get this information to you. So let's talk about the Accord model. This is the model that was developed by Ithaca, and we've used it at ETVU for the last 3 or 4 years now. These are the criteria that you can use, and I would like for you to use in the class. We're going to be using this in an assignment to go through and start to think about how can we evaluate information. And so the Accord model, it's an acronym. So A stands for agenda, and we'll go through all of these in a minute. A stands for agenda, C, credentials, C, citations, O, oversight, R, relevance, and D for date. So let's navigate out to our LibGuide. Over on the library homepage, you will have a link to this in your Canvas course. This is our page on the library research guides section on evaluating information, and you can refer to this at any point. It's there available for you, and it has some basic information about evaluating here. But I want to go through and specifically look at the Accord model that we're going to be using here. So we'll start out with A. A is for agenda. Some would also call this bias. So we want to think about what is their purpose or what is the reason that they're writing this. Now, anytime we look at information, whether that's on the news, if you're looking at a YouTube video, you can ask yourself, who was this information created for, or who published this? Is the author's purpose to inform me? Is it to entertain me? Sometimes it can be both. Is it to advance a particular opinion? That's when you start seeing that bias really show through. Something else that you can ask when you're doing this is there advertising included in this information? Anytime you see advertising, you've got to know that there could be, not always, but there could be bias towards the opinions of the advertiser who's paid for the ad. And so if we're watching television news, those who are paying for ads are the ones who are actually paying for that news to be produced. And so it is possible that the station or the channel would be influenced by who their advertisers were. So you've got to keep that in mind. We want to look and see, is the information objective, is it factual, or is it subjective, as in an opinion? You want to watch out for inflammatory language or one-sided arguments. A lot of this comes down to understanding communication and how people talk to one another. There could be cultural, religious, political, or personal biases present. Again, everyone has biases, so I cannot tell you to go find the unbiased information. If it is created by humans, it is unlikely that it will be completely free of bias. And so the goal here is to understand what the biases might be. When we think about peer-reviewed journals, we like to think about those as being bias-free. Truth is, they're written by people, so there's probably some form of bias. And most of the time, a good peer-reviewed journal will require their authors to indicate if there's been any type of sponsorship of their research that could conflict or cause them to lean one way or the other. They'll have to designate that in their journal. So the first thing you want to look at is agenda. Most people recognize this as bias, but to look at what are your reasons? What's your purpose? It could be noble. It could be not so noble. Something to be aware of. Next, we'll look at credentials. And this is our way of, if you remember being on the playground and someone tried to tell you what to do, you said, says who. And this is your moment to say, says who, when you encounter information. And so we want to see if this is a person who I consider to have authority, then you're probably going to think twice about whatever it is. If there's a difference between them saying that your mom told you to do something versus your brother or the kid down the street telling you how to do something. And so credentials tell us about someone's qualifications. We're going to look at some of the questions that we could ask about credentials. So we could ask who the author is or who is the creator of this information. That's a great place to start. If you have a website, if you have a source, period, that does not have an author, I get a lot of questions about how do I cite this? It doesn't have an author. A lot of times websites have corporate authors, they don't have personal authors, and so that's a little different, and even then is something to consider. But if you cannot find an author anywhere, I would tell you, friend, to move on from that source. If we don't know who wrote it, there's no really way for us to evaluate their credentials. The next thing we could ask for are the author's affiliations or credentials listed. Most journal articles will have the author's affiliations with a university or a place of employment listed. They'll list their credentials, where they got their degrees, alongside the journal articles. Sometimes it's harder to find that. Sometimes you have to do a separate search to find out who the author is. With Google, it's quite easy to see who the author is and what their credentials are. It's usually a simple search. Something else we could look at is the contact information listed for the author or the organization. If an organization or an author has made a website and they don't give me any way to contact them, I'm a little nervous about using this. There's no way for me to ask them a question. Actually, most people don't notice this in journal articles. There's usually a way to contact at least the lead author in a journal article. There is publication and organization information, contact information in a book. And so there are ways to contact the author, usually. That's a good sign. What are the qualifications of the author or the group that published the information? So we can look at what are their qualifications. Where do they, from where do they draw their expertise? Whether that is from experience, that is from an academic experience that they have, whether they have some sort of degree, or maybe they've just been in this for a long time. You can evaluate their qualifications and see why it is that you would trust them. If the source is a website, you can look at their domain. .com, .org, and .net are available for anyone to get. There's sort of a misconception that if it's .org that it has to be a nonprofit. That's originally what those were intended for when those domains were created, but there's nothing governing that. I could create a .org tomorrow and no one would be the wiser that I wasn't an actual nonprofit. So be wary of that. .gov is restricted to government websites. If you see a .gov, you are on a government website. Same thing for .edu. Those are restricted to academic, school related websites. And so those two are the only ones that are policed by anyone. So just keep that in mind. .com came from commercial, and so that's something to keep in mind again, drawing back on the agenda and those advertisers. And then does the organization appear to sponsor this information? If someone has done some research on the effects of caffeine on athletes, and it's sponsored by Monster energy drinks or Coca-Cola, then perhaps there is an issue there. It's just something to be aware of. All right, the next C is citations. These are my favorite. All right, so going back to our scholarship as a conversation, all of this information is interconnected somehow. And as our author of our text puts it, the real joy of research is rubbing shoulders with the greats who have gone before. Another way to say it would be, the great thing about doing all this is you can listen into the conversations of others who have contributed to that collective body of work. And so citations, when they give you citations, it's a sign that the author has done their own research and is willing to share that with you. It's akin to when your math teacher used to tell you to show your work. The same thing goes for authors. We expect them to show us their work. That is a sign that, number one, they didn't make this up out of thin air, and number two, that they are abiding by ethical information practices that we'll talk about in Unit 6 or 7. So things you can think about when you're looking for citations. First of all, does the author cite the work of others? A list of citations at the end is not necessarily citing a work. So unless you can tell in that paper or in that writing or on that video, unless you can tell where that information came from, it's not technically a citation. That's a bibliography at the end, which can tell you where their information came from generally, but it's not actually giving you enough information to know specifically which thing came from which source. And so it's a good thing that they listed a bibliography. It's a better thing if they cite their sources in text for you as well. Are you able to retrace the author's research path? And then what types of sources did the author cite? Look at those sources. If they cited all Wikipedia pages, that's going to be different than if they cited 15 journal articles. And so you want to look and see, are these scholarly? Are they popular? Is it balanced or one-sided? It'd be kind of like if your doctor came to you and said, well, according to WebMD, you have, we would lose a little confidence in our doctor if our doctor was using WebMD to diagnose us. And so we want to think through what kinds of sources are they citing in their bibliography, if they have one. Our next criterion is oversight. And so we've talked about this when we talked about the peer review process. Oversight is defined as the action of overseeing something. So we want to think about, has this information been through some kind of review or editing process? I'm going to put a link in your Canvas this week to look at what peer review actually means. There's a great video on that I'm going to share with you if you need a visual of what actually goes on in the peer review process. That is our best review process that we have. It's not perfect. But when we start to look at these other things, so websites managed by organizations may have some oversight, but generally websites are the wild, wild west when it comes to information oversight, because anyone can publish anything, and so it's something to keep in mind. We also have certain publishers that we trust over others, and so we have to think about that as well. Things you can ask yourself when you're trying to determine oversight is there any way for you to tell if this has been reviewed or edited? A journal will tell you that this is a peer-reviewed journal. A magazine will show you who the editorial board is at the front and what their affiliations are, usually. Are there reviewers, editors, experts in the field? Is this journal, book, or website published or sponsored by a trusted organization, a scholarly society, a professional association, or a college or university academic department or publishing press? And so you want to look through who is publishing this information, and what level of oversight do I think they have. Sometimes it's hard to get at this information outside of things that we know have been reviewed and edited. And so just something to keep in mind. This would be a reason that when we start to look at that continuum of reliability, that we would put most websites further down than we would put other print resources or something like a scholarly journal. Something else that gets overlooked when we're evaluating information is whether or not the source is actually relevant to your question. I see a lot of times that a source that a student may use or a researcher may use may contain the word in it somewhere, but it's not actually related to their source. It's sort of like if you were researching business ethics and you found things on nursing ethics. They have ethics in common, but they're going to be drastically different. And so you want to make sure that the thing that you're using fits. Just like my shape sorter here on the screen, you want to make sure that it is actually useful to answer the question that you're looking for. So does this information relate to or answer your research topic? If not, it doesn't matter how credible it is. You really don't need it. If this is an assignment, does this information meet the requirements? If you have been told by your professor or your boss that it needs to be a certain kind of information, a certain type, then it doesn't matter how credible it is. Is this information over your head? I see people run into this all the time. If you can't read it and understand it, if it's too technical, some of these journal articles are too technical, then maybe it's not the information that you need. Or it could be written below your level. I've had college students come in and use a children's book to write some sort of biographical thing, and that's just too simple. So you've got to evaluate it for that too. Who was the intended audience for this information? Who are they trying to speak to here? Is it someone like you, or is it some other group? And then how much information is covered? Does this just skim the surface, or does it provide an in-depth analysis? And so depending on what your needs are, you want to think about, does this cover what I need? Is this, because it's an encyclopedia article and it's only 200 words, is this really what I need? At the point that you get to in your research, it's unlikely that something that's 200 words long will answer your question. And then we want to look at date. Now, most people know about date, but I want to highlight it here. Evaluating date requires that you think about the type of information you're using. So it's not just that you are using the most recent information. If you're doing historical research, primary sources are better and more appropriate to the type of research that you're doing. And so with that, you would actually want something that was very old versus something that was brand new. And so date is contextual in terms of what kind of information you're looking for. And so when we look at things about fast changing disciplines, like any of the health disciplines, anything having to do with health or technology, those kinds of things that are rapidly changing in the sciences, then you don't want something from the 1960s if you're researching the most up-to-date information. And so you want to think through how does the date on this impact the specific subject that you're researching. Now, I will caution you that sometimes you do want the thing that is the seminal piece of work that was done. If you're researching, for me, if I was researching information literacy, then I probably at some point want to go back and look up the first article, the first time that term was used, and talk about and try to understand how it has changed over the years, if that's my purpose and if that helps me to answer my question. And so there is a place for that. I want you to be aware of the date, though, and make sure. As a general rule, we kind of tell you to start out with something within the last 5 years. It could be something in the last 3 years if it's that rapidly changing of a topic. I would caution, unless you are doing historical or religious research, or literary research, something in the humanities, I would caution you about going more than 10 years back. So we want to look at when was this information published or when was it last updated. If you can't tell, if you're on a website and you can't tell when it was published or updated, that's a cautionary moment for you. That's a time when you should be thinking about whether or not you want to use that. Most websites, most news sites will tell you the date of something. And so if you can't tell the date, maybe you need to move along. Is it possible that newer articles exist on this topic? So sometimes you want to use that article, but you also want to go find some more that are more current. And so you can do that as well. Or if there are more appropriate articles, you can leave the older one behind. Are the references that were used, citations or the links, are they up to date? If you're on a website and you're clicking on things and none of the links work, you are reaching that 404, we don't know where this link is message. That's a pretty good indication that somebody has not updated that website recently. And so that's a good time for you to move along. Is your topic in an area where rapid changes occur, or just like I said, or is it using an older source acceptable? And so again, that goes back to thinking about how useful is this particular source in light of the thing that I'm researching, in light of my subject here. So that's the Accord model. Agenda, credentials, citations, oversight, relevance, and date. We also want to talk about, so at the beginning of this unit, I mentioned that we want to think in terms of a continuum of reliability. And what I mean when I say that, I get this idea from Kevin Klipfeld. And his way of explaining this, I shy away from telling students something is good or bad, or a yes or no that you can use something, because you really need to think critically about it. You really need to be able to evaluate it in light of the context that you are researching. So you need to think about your research topic and think about whether or not that is something that's going to be appropriate based on what you're looking at. So if we can think about it on a scale, and for that example, I'm using the Scoville scale. So that's the scale of hot peppers. And if you're someone who likes to participate, I would invite you to go pull your hot peppers out of your refrigerator, and you can try them along with us if you would like to experience this. So when we look at the Scoville scale, a bell pepper falls at the very bottom of the Scoville scale. The score is 0. It is the least spicy pepper. On the other end of the scale, though, you'll see that the ghost pepper is the hottest pepper listed. And then in between those, we have other spices like my examples here are sriracha, Tabasco, and habanero. And so we know that there is a continuum of hotness, a continuum of spiciness when we look at peppers. And I want you to use that same idea to think about the information that you're encountering. So if we can start to think about information that way, we can see where it falls on this continuum. There's a scale. No source is totally bad, no source is totally good. There's a scale, and we want to compare them to one another when we're trying to evaluate them. Now, that's not to say when you're in academic writing, a lot of times there will be sources that your instructor tells you are off limits. They are off limits if your instructor tells you that they are off limits. But for our purposes, we want to think about where things fall on a scale. And so right here, my example is at the very bottom of our scale would be something like the National Enquirer, not based on research. It's widely known that it is not trustworthy generally as a source. Something else that could fall down here would be websites with hundreds of pop-up ads, misspellings, things of that nature. And then at the very top of our scale here is the top journal in the field for that particular research. Here I've got something like the American Journal of Psychology. And then you want to think about, where does your source fall on this continuum? So if a journal, a peer-reviewed journal, is at the top of the continuum versus something that's at the very bottom down there. If you need an example, if you'd like to work through this, I've got an example here of some resources that I looked at. I went through and evaluated these. So one is a website. The second one here is a journal article from the Journal of Biosciences. And then the third is actually a video that I found on YouTube that was done by the American Chemical Society. And so when you go to the next page here, you'll be able to see where I put those in terms of their reliability. Source 1, Source 3, and Source 2. And then I went through for each one of them and tried to explain my justification for why. And you're going to actually do this. When you do your Accord Model assignment this week, you're going to do something that looks very similar to this. So Source 1, I go through for each letter on the Accord Model. I go through and explain how I reasoned that this was, how I came to the conclusion that this belonged where it did on the continuum scale. And so you see this website. It is very relevant to our topic, but when we started looking at all the other pieces of the Accord Model, this is not a terrible source, but it is low on our continuum in comparison to the other sources that we have. What's interesting is this YouTube video is produced by the American Chemical Society, and so you'll want to look through and see how I worked through that. A lot of times we dismiss something based solely on its format, and I want you to move away from doing that. I want you to start thinking about information outside of its container or outside of its format. Format tells us something, and if format is good, and I've referred a lot to journal articles, and that's me referring to a specific format for you to give you some framework there to hang things on. But I don't want you to reject things just because of the format. Formats are changing and constantly evolving, and so to say you're only going to use a book may mean that you miss out on something that is very relevant and very credible for your source. And so I want you to start thinking in that direction. If you're noticing a theme here, it's all critical thinking about the information that you're encountering. And then finally, Source 2. This is not the perfect source. When I went through and evaluated this source, if I had a newer journal article, I probably would use it. This one is from 2012, so it's getting on up there in journal age. Someone else may have written something. I did go out and look at the research statement on this particular journal. One of the things that I noticed was it is relevant in that it talks about that ghost pepper, but it's not relevant if I'm unable to comprehend. It's a highly technical scientific journal article. And so if that's not my purpose, if that's not part of the thing that I'm trying to understand about my research question here, then while it is highly credible, it's still not relevant. And so we need to go back and think about that as well. So those three sources are examples for you as you work through your assignment this week. Think back to the Accord Model. All of that is available in there for you. This video will be available for you. If you have any questions, let me know. This is something that I think is really foundational to understanding the information that we're dealing with. I want this to become second nature for you. Not so much that you memorize the Accord Model by heart, although I would recommend that. But this line of thinking about things and these basic concepts of thinking about information become second nature for you, and you're used to thinking about things in these terms. I may have pointed out some things that you hadn't thought about or given a lot of thought about too before, but hopefully this has shed some light on why different professors require different things, and then how you can transfer that into your professional life and think about how you can evaluate the information. Even if you're not dealing with journal articles in the professional realm, how can you evaluate the information that you're receiving? And how can you look for that agenda or that bias? And how can you look for those credentials and citations and oversight, relevance, and date? How can you begin to look for those things, even in your personal information consumption? How can you begin to look through and really develop your critical thinking about information?